I'm Ted Land with a look back at the timeline of Paul Allen's life. It starts in 1953. That's when he was born here in Seattle. In 1968, he met Bill Gates at Lakeside High School. The two went to school together, and that was a very important relationship early on in their lives. 1975, Allen and Gates formed the company that eventually grew into Microsoft. In 1982, Allen learned that he has Hodgkin's disease. That's a disease he would have to deal with for years throughout his life. 1983, Allen resigned from Microsoft after that diagnosis to pursue some other things in his life that he was interested in. 1986, that's when he forms Vulcan. It's the umbrella company that oversees all of his various ventures. 1988, that's when he bought the Portland Trail Blazers. That turned out to be a very profitable move. In 1995, voters rejected the Seattle Commons proposal. Allen and others wanted to build a giant park in South Lake Union, and he ended up at the end of it with several acres of space in South Lake Union that eventually became the Amazon campus. That's another very profitable move. 1997, that's when Paul Allen bought the Seattle Seahawks and prevented them from leaving the city. He was also really into music, and so in 2000, he opened the EMP, which today is the Mopop Museum, a very popular attraction in Seattle. 2002, he formed a private space company that actually put a spaceship into space in the years following that. 2003, that's when he launched the Allen Institute for Brain Science, one of the leading research agencies here in Seattle. 2009, we learned his late-stage non-Hodgkin's lymphoma diagnosis. That's something that he would have to deal with for many years after that. In 2010, he signed the Giving Pledge, committing to give away half of his wealth to philanthropic endeavors after he died. And then earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, we learned that his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which he battled in 2009, had returned. He said he was optimistic about his treatment and he vowed to fight the cancer, but today we learned of his death. He wanted to do so many things in his life. This is just a snapshot of it. He really did a lot.